Hello and welcome to the Practical Animal channel with me, John Beaumont. The channel is for you if you are curious about what it takes to work with animals. Domestic animals, wild animals in the wild animals in captivity. We do our best to cover it all. Most weeks we arrange interviews with animal industry professionals to elicit their insights into what it takes to be successful doing what they do. My guests this week are a husband and wife team whose specialisms are wildlife veterinary pathology and animal law. It's Professor John E. and Mrs. Margaret E. Cooper. They have global experience in their specialities, having lectured in, amongst other institutions, the University of the West Indies in Trinidad and Tobago, the University of Florida in the US, and the University of Cambridge in the UK. They, between them, have edited book chapters, published technical papers, co-authored technical papers, and they have contributed to flagship conservation programs, including the Mauritius Kestrel and the Mountain Gorilla Conservation Project in Rwanda. And they are here today to join us to share their insights into their, frankly, amazing careers. Professor John and Mrs. Margaret Cooper, welcome to the Practical Animal channel.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Please, can you begin by telling us how did your careers develop from the beginning to your exalted positions today?
I've been nominated to start off with this. I come from a legal family. There are 6 of us who are lawyers spread over 4 generations. I always, as a child, loved going to my father's office. And as I got older, I used to do work experience with him on a fairly basic level. He said, you've got to start with making the tea. And so I did. But of course, once I'd done my A-levels, I really wanted to move on and study a new subject. So I decided I was going to apply for law. And when I finished my degree, I came back to be trained as a solicitor by my father.
And as far as I'm concerned, I started life as a schoolboy naturalist, and I'm still a naturalist, and originally thought I might be a medical entomologist or a professional naturalist in South America or Malaysia or somewhere hot and exciting, etc. My father was very sensible and said, why don't you train as a veterinary surgeon? No one had ever been to university in my family, so it was quite a pioneer experience to do so. So I went to university, I went to Bristol University, and in my first few months, I met a girl called Margaret Vowles, who is now Margaret Cooper and sitting on my right. And the rest of it will come later.
And that's exactly how I got drawn into animal law, because mixing with vets, John was always eager to run meetings. We are members of an organisation, the Universities Federation for Animal Welfare. And when he ran meetings, as particularly multi-interest ones, he would expect me to help give a lecture on a legal aspect. And so it got me in at an early age. And also it's linked with one of the books I shall mention later. And also, once we were married, although I was really the CEO of the home front, keeping the children and the home going, I used to write and lecture from quite the kitchen table. And John would bring me writing and lecturing contacts and invitations from his work. Then when we lived abroad, again, I couldn't really work because the work permits are not available for spouses, but I did informal lecturing. I was always welcome in the whatever veterinary community he was working in, and I kept my writing going. And when we went to conferences, although I didn't understand a lot of the subjects, I would attend any lectures that had a legal connection, and then I would plague all his contacts and colleagues at the conference for copies of their legislation from their particular country. Because remember, there was no internet, so one had to beg, borrow, write for legislation on animals. And so all that came together eventually in 1987 when I wrote a book on animal law. So that's, if you can see, that is the book. So that's really the story of my life.
And as far as I'm concerned, going back a little, when I graduated in 1966 from Bristol, Margaret was doing her articles to become a solicitor, so she was still studying. I'd been very fortunate. I'd been to a state school, I'd got a state scholarship, and Her Majesty's government had paid for my education, which anyone watching this who is younger than us will say, golly, you were lucky, a veterinary course paid entirely by the government. And I felt I owed something to the world for that. And it was a time when countries were becoming independent after, in Africa and elsewhere, after Britain supervising, administering them, etc. So I went for a year as a volunteer with voluntary service overseas as a veterinary officer in Tanzania. I was in fact the first vet they'd ever had, which was an experiment in itself. I'll talk about the motorbike they issued me with if you ever invite us back again. I had a wonderful year there, but of course, as Margaret said, no emails, no mobile phones. We didn't speak for a year. We weren't engaged or anything, but we just exchanged aerograms, blue aerograms, and we have all those blue aerograms upstairs and are frightened to reread them. And then I came back, did postgraduate studies in tropical medicine at Edinburgh. We got married in 1969, and then went out to Africa again, to Kenya, where I was a veterinary research officer, doing mainly conventional domestic animal work, but of course it spills over beautifully in tropical countries into wildlife. And we were there for 4 years, and our children were born there, etc. We decided we wanted our children to grow up in this country, remembering that Kenya was a newly independent country. It's their country, much as we love it. It's our second home. So we came back to this country. Our children went to school here. But then once they went to university, we hopped on a plane and went back to Africa, to Tanzania, then went on to Rwanda, then to the United Arab Emirates. And then the most recent part of our work, and you alluded to it, John, was we were in Trinidad and Tobago for nearly 7 years until 2009. And what we tried to do throughout that time is to bring together our interests. Margaret's explained hers. You want to say anything about that, or am I carrying on here?
I think you can continue.
Yeah, I've got permission to carry on. And one field, quite apart from the lecturing and so on, one field that we have been able to develop, which your viewers may or may not know much about, is the field of veterinary forensics. This is one of the books we're not meant to be promoting our books, ladies and gentlemen. We're just, so you've got the titles. That incidentally is available in Spanish as well, and our South American colleagues like it. And more recently, this one here on wildlife forensic investigation. And you say, well, that's interesting. What's it all about? Well, of course, it brings together the legal side, Margaret's, and my veterinary pathology interests, and the sort of things we might be asked to do. I mean, most people think forensics, are they looking at assaults on animals? Yes, sometimes battered pets, dogs, etc. But that's a tiny part of forensics. And much of mine is using what pathology skills I have to help in investigations. So for example, especially for you, John, here's the foot, a mounted foot. You'll see immediately it's some sort of eagle, etc. This is the sort of thing I might be confronted with, or we might be confronted with, and the police might say, we've just found this on someone's premises. Do they need a permit for it, etc.? What species is it? And so I enjoy doing that sort of thing. And of course, standard post-mortem examinations. Or it might be a tortoise, for example. I wish you had live animals on this thing. This is a shell, a carapace and the plastron of a tortoise, thank you, steadied by my wife, as always. And they might say, imagine it's a live one, the chap who's got this claims it's captive bred, but do you think it might have been imported in his suitcase from Southern Europe? And then investigations would be carried out. This one actually has pyramiding of the shell, which suggests very strongly it had a calcium phosphorus imbalance at one stage and therefore probably was in captivity. And I've got lots of other examples here, but there's not time. I've got some super bones, but we'll do those next time. Bones of animals, I mean. So that's the forensics, and that's something that we've been able to bring together and be of some service to society, and occasionally pick up a fee. Most of the time we do things voluntarily nowadays. Right, must stop there, I think, for the next question. Is that right?
Next question is, well, first of all, what was that the foot of? Was that an eagle? Was that a
It is an eagle, yes. Yes, it's a steppe eagle.
Steppe eagle.
Yeah, Aquila, well, it used to be Aquila rapax something. It's Aquila nipensis, I think now. They've just been given it a different, it's actually, I'm cheating, it's one of my specimens, but I had to find a bird of prey because of your own experience. And yeah, but it's a jolly good paperweight and it is legal. And I do have a lawyer to substantiate that.
Yeah, I said harpy. It couldn't possibly be a harpy, but I did want to know what it was. Thank you for putting that on.
No.
So, next question. What skills and personal qualities does a person need to be a specialist veterinary pathologist and specialist in animal law?
Well, shall I start this? Yes. Yeah, I would say to be a veterinary pathologist, a veterinary surgeon, a wildlife vet, all of those, the first thing is a sense of curiosity, being interested in things. That's why my natural history is so important. When I go out on my bicycle, I find things that are familiar to naturalists like you, John. I might find in the woods here a pine cone, and next to it a pine cone that looks a bit different and quite clearly has been nibbled by a squirrel. We no longer have red squirrels here, but even when I find these, and I've been looking at them for most of my life, I'm intrigued by them. Is this a squirrel? Might it be a red squirrel? We used to have them here. How long ago did it feed, etc.? So I'm actually honing my pathology skills to a certain extent by looking at natural history. And the other thing I think is to look outside the box. If you, whatever, I mean, some of your viewers will not become vets because the competition is very tight, as you know here. But some will go into other allied fields, working with animals. And that sense of curiosity is important there, but also looking outside the box, thinking rather differently from other people, and be prepared for the unexpected. I'm not stripping down, but I usually carry a hand lens with me, you see. I carry this every day, not just because I appear to your viewers to be in my dotage, but because I can then examine a specimen, etc., etc. So it's little things like that that mark someone out, and whether they become a veterinary pathologist or not, as someone who can contribute to the natural world and indeed to animal care. I've talked too much. Next one, please.
Yes, I would say that you've got to have an interest in the subject. In this case, it would be animals and then leading to animal law. I think some people nowadays describe it as a passion because everything is exaggerated. But whatever it is, you've got to have something that drives you on. But I don't think that's sufficient. You've got to have some training in whatever comes your way, or a profession, better still, that gives you the tools then to move on and do something that will give you the experience and in applying your knowledge and the law that will take you on to that level of having a special interest in animal law.
And would it be true to say being married to a vet can be an advantage, or would you disagree on that one?
Well, yes, actually, I would admit to it, because when you're reading the law, sometimes you need to interpret something. What is this definition of an animal? What do they mean by this? And you need the technical expertise that comes from a vet. And we very often put our heads together over a piece of legislation.
Right. I think that's probably on to your next question, is it, John?
Yes.
We're cheating because we went through the questions beforehand.
But we also think we should keep some of them short.
Yes.
So it's allied to the previous one. How do you see wild animal veterinary pathology and animal law developing, say, 10 or 20 years from now?
Yes, well, could almost amalgamate the questions you gave us originally. Well, I think this field that I'm interested in, I'm involved in with Margaret's support, is a rapidly developing one, obviously. As far as veterinary pathology is concerned, as you know only too well, pathology, the investigation, logos, the study of disease, covers everything nowadays from molecular techniques right through to sort of broad-based veterinary pathology, broad-based in the sense that you're, as I said, looking outside the box. So people will, and I've done some of it, be looking at cetaceans, looking at whales and dolphins and so on. I do a lot with invertebrates. We actually have a veterinary invertebrate society and are consulted by collections, zoos and elsewhere where their spiders are dying or their locusts have got some strange parasite. I don't need to tell you, and it's probably obvious from my appearance, that I'm very much in the latter, the non-molecular category, not because the molecular isn't important, but because I don't understand it terribly well, whereas I do think I understand animals. And yours?
Yes, I've got to, I would say there are two words about this, and I'll enlarge on them. One is complexity and the other one is disparity. The complexity is, I think the law is bound to get more complex. It has been growing since the early days when I took an interest in this. The European Union legislation is like a nightmare, and to understand and to grasp. And the other thing is that in Britain we have devolution, and while the different countries within the UK share some legislation, I think it's going to become more and more distinct. And so you'll have to be, if you want to look at, say, animal welfare or conservation issues, you're going to have to look at the law for England. Wales, well, it usually goes along with England, but they have some of their own. Scotland will be separate, and Northern Ireland already is, in most things, has its own but equivalent legislation. So I think that's an area. I think that in the countries which have already fairly good quality animal law, this will be improved and so on as they go along, increased penalties, increased enforcement. But where there's great disparity is within, if you look at animal law throughout the world, some are very high quality, some are very poor, left somewhere at the beginning of the 20th century. Those are the countries who are hard pressed to look after their people, let alone their animals and their legislation. But those are coming under pressure. The law is becoming much more available because of the internet, and also they're coming under pressure from other countries or from organizations to improve that law. Conservation, and with the law relating to mountain gorillas, is a particular matter where this needs upgrading in some countries, and the pressure is coming from, say, the neighboring countries or the range states. They're trying to get better awareness, better enforcement, and better penalties. And we can see, I can see that coming.
You brought into that question, John, the point about the future. And one of the things you asked us when we were planning this was about the next 20 years. And I think Margaret's answered her bit. I would like to add something, if I may. And that is, I think that veterinary pathology has to become much more integrated with other subjects. We're conscious that many of your viewers will not become veterinary surgeons or veterinary pathologists, but still might like to contribute to animal health and so on. And this term that is used, One Health, it's a lovely term, but it still isn't working properly, as we've seen from the coronavirus outbreak. There have not been vets in the front line. There have been many working behind the scenes. We have them at Cambridge. And there is a need, I think, and this will happen soon, I think, following this sad pandemic, that people from different disciplines will come together. I speak of someone, and I didn't talk about this, who has worked with the medical profession in Africa, in Trinidad, 3 years with the Medical Research Council, and for 13 years, I taught pathology at the Royal College of Surgeons of England and taught medics and vets. So it's second nature to me to work with medical and veterinary professionals. And like you, with your background in conservation, on the other end of the spectrum, if you like, we both work with conservationists, with field biologists, etc. And this integrated, this spectrum seems to me to be so exciting. Of course, I'm proud to be a veterinary surgeon, but I'm equally proud to be part of the environmental and conservation movement. So I think that integration is important, and many of your viewers might take some comfort in the fact they may not, for reasons outside their control, be able to do what we do, but there are many other openings, and you could contribute to this field and advise people like me, who, as I said, over molecular matters, really need someone who's a bit younger and comprehends the system. I think that I've talked too much.
No, that's
time to cut the video and have coffee.
Something that has just popped into my mind a moment ago. So not one of the questions that I sent you, but it's relevant. Michael Soule was one of the founders of the science of conservation biology. Is it fair to say that you are the founders or amongst the founders of wildlife veterinary forensics?
Could mention the first book.
Yes, I think it goes back to a long time. There have been vets working in forensics for forever, because people wanted evidence, and particularly related to horses or cattle or insurance claims. But I think in the 80s, we became aware that there was something distinctive here, that evidence was needed in wildlife cases. And I know that John was sort of instinctively keen on it, having had some experience. And we got together at a conference, didn't we then? And I think it's grown in awareness since then. I don't necessarily say we would want to claim that we're the founders. I would say there were people working into that direction, and it all sort of has emerged in the last last 10 years or so, or 15 years. People have been writing books about it.
I wish I was modest like Margaret, but I would like to add our 2007 book was probably one of, or possibly the first book on veterinary forensic medicine, certainly in the English language.
Yeah,
No, I think Margaret's right. You stand on giants' shoulders, it's said, and we were building on what other people had done, but we had the opportunity together to bring a bit of synergism to it.
Interesting. On to my next question, which is of particular personal interest to me because it's where I began my career. Please, can you talk about your involvement with the Mauritius Kestrel project?
Right, I'll start. Well, it started in Nairobi in 1973.
Yes, and I say it's lovely to talk to someone who has actually worked in the project. We, in 1973, we were invited to a dinner at a restaurant in Kajabi Street in Nairobi. Our host was John Hopcroft, who is an eminent ornithologist and conservationist in Kenya, Kenya born and bred. And then he invited who's Stanley Temple, yes, who became a good friend of ours, who's a leading ecologist from Wisconsin. And at this dinner was discussed the Mauritius Kestrel.
Yes, the Mauritius Kestrel was the reason for the dinner, but it was more than that, because Stanley Temple, who's a biologist, ecologist, as Margaret said, was keen that I might become the veterinary advisor to the project. He was going out to Mauritius, and let's remind your viewers that Mauritius was the home of the dodo until it was exterminated in 1692, whichever the year was. And he asked if I would be the advisor. I have to say here, and this is not a hard luck story, yet another honorary appointment. Everything is honorary, and we get to our stage now, the whole of life seems to be honorary, but this was honorary. But of course, we jumped at the opportunity. We were about to come back to Britain, but here was a link with an exciting project. And so what happened was, again, no emails, whatever. We communicated with the Mauritius project. Stanley was out there investigating whether the Mauritius Kestrel, Fulco punctatus, had indeed dropped to only 4 individuals. That's a little bit debatable, but it doesn't matter. There were very few of them there. And so he communicated by letter with us and by cable, telegram, whatever you call it, telex as well, when necessary. But we did more than that. We were able, following Stanley Temple's return to Wisconsin, each time an expatriate went out from America, from Britain, from wherever to join the project, they had to go through Heathrow in those days. And we would go down to Heathrow, sometimes with our 2 young children, have a meal with them, all part of being the honorary veterinary advisor, I have to say, buying the meal, I mean. Then we would hand over a medicine box and sample box. It would be a plastic box like a field kit, if you like, and it would have some basic medication, some little tubes and swabs and so on. And the person going out, and also some information about helping, because none of them was a vet, of course. They were all biologists and good people, but no little veterinary knowledge. And they would then send material back. So they would send, and it needed Margaret's knowledge of the law, because swabs had to come back, and we had to get Ministry of Agriculture, as it was then, permission, etc. And not only that, it wasn't too long until we lost one or two of the captive Mauritius kestrels. And of course, I was in my element, much as I love Mauritius kestrels, because I could have a look and actually try and find out why they died. And in fact, the first one we looked at was remarkable, and I'm not leaving the screen, I'm just picking this up, because we diagnosed a cancer, a tumor, an ovarian adenocarcinoma in this bird. And there it is in a museum pot. One of my many prized possessions, which is why I only show it to people like John Beaumont on the screen, in case he nicks it. You can cut that out of the video. So that was very exciting. But of course, your viewers will say, well, why is he getting so excited? Well, the point is, of course, that almost certainly there was a bottleneck, as you know very well, in the population. And bottlenecks increase the homozygosity, the genetic likeness, and tumors and things are more likely to arise. But once again, that is very much a story in itself. And then in 1976, the Jersey Zoo, Jersey Wildlife Preservation Trust, Durrell, whatever you want to call it, became involved. But, and then in 1978, a very important year, we were still dealing not with Jersey Zoo, not with anything on Mauritius directly, but with what BirdLife International, as it is now, ICBP as it was then, and Warren King, an eminent American administrator, ornithologist in Washington, phoned us up in 1978. I remember hanging on to the phone and saying, it's a phone call from the United States, as if that was exciting. It isn't now, it was then. And he was saying, we must have another person, a new person, go out to the project in Mauritius. We've had a few problems, bits of politics and so. Can you suggest anyone? And so we said to him, why don't you contact Carl Jones?
At that time, Carl Jones was a student and undergraduate in London, and but I think his primary love was raising baby birds. And I just say just a love, a talent.
I'm less kind. I think he did very little study. I think he only raised baby birds.
I think he possibly on his own admission too.
And yes, okay. Do you want to say anything more about him? We went out to there, of course, didn't we?
Yes, and then just to jump in the story, by the time we got to 1985-6, we'd managed to get grants together, plus some savings for the whole family to go out to Mauritius over Christmas for 3 weeks and to visit the Mauritius Kestrel Project. We saw the that project, the Pink Pigeon Project, and also we went out to Round Island, and John was delighted to be able to handle their endemic species and so on.
Especially the reptiles.
That's right. It was a remarkable visit. There were a lot of other people out there doing studies at the time, and it made a very fine community for that Christmas.
And as Margaret has explained, the project had changed from being the Mauritius Kestrel Project, Fulco punctatus, we've got to save it. By that stage, it was being saved. Captive breeding on the island, captive breeding at Jersey Zoo, birds going to other zoological collections, a wonderful success story, as you know. But of course, many other species became involved and had done previously, the pink pigeon, the Rodrigues fruit bat, the Round Island skink, the Round Island boa, all these wonderful names. You know, if I can't get to sleep at night, I mutter them to myself, and they help me think the world is getting better, because most of those, between us, Carl has done a wonderful job, but it's been a team effort. Between us, we've helped to save them. I was very lucky because, as I said before, I at that stage was working for the Royal College of Surgeons of England, which would not seem to be the most obvious place for a veterinary pathologist to be cutting up dead animals from Mauritius. But anyone who's ever been there will know it houses the famous Hunterian collection, John Hunter's collection. It is a wonderful, a treasure house of collections, medical and veterinary, going back many, many years, hundreds of years. And they gave me almost a carte blanche to use their facilities because they saw it as a conservation project. It was their contribution. And we were able to write lots of papers on our work. I got my histology done there, my radiography, the bacteriology. It was an absolute delight. And it spawned a lot of publications and helped teach us, which you'll understand, John, and your viewers will hopefully do so, that if we know about the health of these species, it's so much easier to try and save them later on. And then in 1991, we were due to go back to Africa, to Tanzania, as we said before. So I had to step down. Well, it's relatively near Mauritius. I had a full-time professor's job in Tanzania, and Andrew Greenwood took over as the veterinary advisor. Andrew is an eminent zoo vet, as you probably know, in Yorkshire, where I think you're based at the moment, and has been a friend of ours since he was a student. And he followed on with this work, also published papers. It has been a very nice example of a multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary project. And I think vets like yourself, John, and myself, and even animal lawyers got involved in it. So it had to be pretty interdisciplinary. We like to think it was a success story and play a small part in the glory that is the story of the Mauritius kestrel.
Andrew Greenwood, he features very prominently in the books, the Zoo Vet books by David Taylor.
Who was a wonderful chap.
Yeah.
David Taylor. So was Andrew. But David Taylor had that touch of eccentricity, which we're in danger of losing in Britain. We're working on it. You're okay, we're okay, but some of the others are losing their eccentricity.
Yeah. And we knew that Andrew from his student days when he came to ask about vertebrate medicine and so on. And we've worked with him a lot over the years.
He was very deferential in those days, thought we were important. And now, then he overtook, you know, it's a bit like the hare and the tortoise race, you know, etc. No, but he did some great work. And David Taylor, his colleague, was wonderfully eccentric. I was on radio with him several times about exotic animals. And, you know, we were parrying with one another as to who could come out with the most ludicrous but genuine stories. But you don't want that on this. This is not why we're talking to you today.
I collect autographs by eminent animal people. I'm not sure how many autographs Andrew Greenwood has been asked to sign, but I do have his autograph.
Oh, he'll ask for a fee. He's a Yorkshireman, you know. He's a good chap, but he's very, very different from me, except in his interests.
Ladies and gentlemen, so please can you also talk about your involvement in Rwanda with the Mountain Gorilla Project?
Yes, and before we do so, could we just say that the BBC today brought the news that near Agongo, the volcano in Goma on the Rwanda-Congo border is erupting, and hundreds of thousands, or hundreds of people, probably thousands, are being evacuated. We went to that same time, and that's where the mountain gorillas are, next to that where the volcano is. And I looked at it and it really almost moved to tears to see the African families with their babies and so on. So we do think of them today and the plight they face, because the gorillas will survive because Africans want them to survive, not just because we in the West send lots of people out to save them. So we will be thinking of them today. But our story about the mountain gorillas starts, we were in Tanzania, as we said, in '91. In those days, these aid programs, quite rightly in many ways, restricted you to 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, because the idea is to train local people, and we accepted that. But in 1993, we were about to leave Tanzania when I looked at the Journal of Zoo Animal Medicine, and we wanted to stay in Africa, and said to Margaret, you know, they're advertising for a post with the mountain gorillas. In those days, most things were in French, not the advertisement. Even the Americans put a bit of French in, which was very impressive. And they said, we're looking for a director for the Centre Vétérinaire des Volcans. That's the Volcano Veterinary Centre. And that was the name of the centre in those days. And they said it should be someone with experience of primates. And I had that, some of it from working with the Royal College of Surgeons and visiting laboratories and zoos and so on. Someone who had experience of Africa, which of course we both had. We were selling ourselves as a team, really. Able to speak French. Well, my French isn't bad, but Margaret's is jolly good. And of course we had Swahili. And I I modestly would suggest my Swahili is better than Margaret's, but her French is better than mine. So we seemed to make quite a good team. And indeed, we were offered the post.
Yes, what appealed to me about it was the prospect of having to travel across Africa for 3 whole days just to get to this project.
Even sitting with me.
Yes, it was a travel. We had a map, but it was very vague, and we knew what towns we need to go through. That was all. And we had to make our way to the project centre, which was at the foot of the enormous Virunga volcanoes. And it was the most dramatic spot to live for a while.
And is this the way would you like me to come in?
Yes, I think so.
We went there in October 1993 and had 6 months in a little house up on the foothills of the mountain, Mount Sabino. We had no electricity. We didn't even have a generator initially. When it arrived, it was like manna from heaven, this little generator that I had to start or get one of the chaps to start every evening. We had no running water, and at times we had to go and join the locals. It was very good for practicing your Swahili. At the local water pump, etc. It really was roughing it, but we loved it. But the 6 months they're fascinating, but they were difficult. And you'll hear in a minute one of the things that made it difficult. But what was lovely for us was we could go up with the teams, the local African teams, to visit the mountain gorillas every day. My job as the leader of the director was to monitor the health of the gorillas, and that was all done by non-interventional methods, which you will understand, John, because biologists, ecologists do this as well. They observe, they take notes, they make sure the animal can't see them because you get better observations, you follow tracks, you pick up samples and so on. That was tremendous training, and I had to devise field kits, little plastic boxes and things. We were lucky we had porters who could carry them, but sometimes we had to as well, up these slippery slopes, field kits so that if one did have to, just for our routine work, looking at samples, because I mean, if we looked at a fecal sample in the forest, if you wanted to find protozoal parasites, look at it there while it's still warm. Nothing better than a warm gorilla fecal sample to start the day. Wet preparations in saline, and you can see the ciliates and so on moving. But also the little house we had been equipped very sensibly by the American from Seattle who'd set it up with a little lab. And once we had a generator, I could do things there and set that up very much as a wildlife lab. So that was really very exciting. However, after the 6 months, on April the 6th, 1994, you see, we know the dates without looking, the genocide in Rwanda erupted, like the volcano last night in Goma. We knew things were happening, there'd been unrest, weapons had been distributed to people, etc. And we don't particularly like telling the story of the rest of it for obvious reasons. And we were evacuated. We evacuated ourselves. We went up in the mountains because we couldn't go down the main road. We encountered roadblocks, etc. We got into Zaire, the Congo as it is now, where we were looked after very kindly for 2 or 3 days, and we were flown into Burundi, and then we got the last military flight out to Nairobi. I still relive it. However, we got to Nairobi, we came to England, and Margaret will continue the story.
Yeah, so we had to stay out of the country for a while, but after a few weeks, John went back, and I followed him a few weeks later after that to pull the project back together as soon as it was safe to go into the country. We were based in Nairobi, which to us was a bonus because we were coming back to our home of the 1970s, and we had this glorious journey of 1,000 kilometers or more to Kigali and then back again every month. But in that time in Rwanda, we had to pull our project together, put up with the bad news of people and friends that we'd lost, and also to get our staff working again. And it was a lot more difficult to go and see the gorillas. We had to have military permission each time, and then we had to have military escorts as well. And this is quite complex. But we have to say that in all this and all the terrible things that went on and people moving through the mountains, the gorillas themselves actually did perfectly well during that time.
Having said that, some of the problems that we encountered were quite exciting ones in a veterinary sense. It was during that period that I only ever immobilized 3 mountain gorillas. We assisted gorillas that were caught in snares and traps and so on, where you could do it physically, because you tried to do it without using immobilizing drugs. But we did have to immobilize 3 mountain gorillas on 3 occasions because of snare injuries. And your viewers might like to see the sort of snares that are still used. One should say there in Rwanda, where traditionally gorillas were respected as wazee, as old men in the forest and so on, something, and you have it in South America with some of the groups there in the Amazon and so on, that they respect the animals around them. So the sort of snares that would be used, but these were being set for antelopes. These are poor people. They haven't got much protein. So they would, some of the snares they would set, and these are genuine ones from Rwanda. This one is made of local materials. You can see it's vegetation, and that's a very standard one, and people can make that. They can just find the materials in the vegetation, in the undergrowth. More sinister ones as far as the injuries, because gorillas would get caught. They get caught in the snare that was meant for something else. Surprisingly, even this sort here, just this braided nylon, would be sufficient to catch a gorilla, particularly a young one, round the wrist. And for some reason, they have not learned how to take them off. They ought to be taught, and we've got some ideas for that. And then the worst of all, and this is one I actually removed from a gorilla, is this is braided wire. I expect you, can you see that there? And it was attached there. And that was just over 2 of the digits, which I had to amputate in the immobilized gorilla. I should say that our staff there, once it had been done, they gave the gorilla the name Bahati, which is Swahili for good luck, because it had had good luck to be treated by the veterinarian, by the veterinary officer. So that was fun. But then in 1995, as Margaret said, we went back for nearly a year to the project. We felt again we should move on. We're quintessential old-fashioned British expatriates who believe that countries have to train their own people, we're always available, etc. And we went to the UAE, United Arab Emirates, but we've kept in touch ever since. And in fact, in recent years, we've been back teaching at a very nice veterinary hospital in Rwanda, in northern Rwanda, which has given us a lot of pleasure. We've done other things as well. We set up a gorilla pathology study group, which is made up mainly of Africans who work in the range states, but some expatriates as well. And we circulate things. For example, someone says, oh, we've got strange lesions in one of my gorillas. And they've all got marvelous cameras now, phones, and not the sort of thing John Cooper carries. You know, why has this got strange lesions, if you can see it? Why has it got strange lesions on there? You'll know, John, diagnosis, telemedicine isn't everything it's made out to be, but we can circulate these things and try and help our colleagues who are often working under really parlous conditions. So we started the GPSG, the Gorilla Pathology Study Group. And then because we met a man named Gordon Hull, who's never been to Africa, but has been studying gorilla specimens in museums for 30 years, he said to us, oh, couldn't we do a book together? And the Coopers are foolish. You ask us about books, we always say, oh yes, we'll do a book, and regret it for the next 5 years. And so we produced this book, Gorilla Pathology and Health. It's by Cooper and Hull, as you can see, but Margaret wrote, and I must say this, a superb chapter, good example of the legal input on conservation law, not just relating to gorillas in Central Africa and West Africa, but all the implications, which you'll understand that they have them in South America as well, in many of the countries, because the law has to fit in with local communities and sustainable use and so on, etc. Not much sustainable use of gorillas, but many of the other species there. So our hearts are still in Rwanda, as you realize from my feeling a bit emotional, there's a sad side to it. Right, I think we'll move on from there because you'll never stop us talking.
What are the 5 most influential books that have shaped your thinking?
Right, I've been nominated to go first on this. My first choice is a little book here called A Pattern of Islands by Arthur Grimble. It was published in 1955 by a person who had was started. He writes about the start of his career. He wanted to be a district officer in the colonial service, and this was back in 1913. So it's a long way back. It's in the colonial era, and he applied to go to what he calls then the Gilbert and Ellice Islands. It's now Kiribati, and which is apparently how the Gilbertese pronounce Gilbert. So, you know, there's a little colonial heritage there. It's not a clean break with a new name. And he wanted to go there, and he describes his life there. He was there as a trainee district officer, the lowest of the lowest, as the colonial officer is concerned. But once he got there, he discovered, well, you are the district officer. There's no one else. And I loved the descriptions of the islands, the sea, the remoteness, the sense of adventure in this person, and then the cultural interactions between this young British person with very little experience of life or anything.
As we all were.
And these robust Gilbert and Ellice Islanders. And it caught my imagination. I've always lived with it. But there's another aspect that he made it very clear, the complete disconnect with the colonial office and what they said he was to do and what his duties were and what actually happened when he got to the islands. And I have to say that whether it's colonial times or modern times, that still applies to the people, the difference between the people who employ you when you go to an overseas project, particularly in the sort of wilder areas, and what actually happens on the ground. And that is still there today, whether it won't be the colonial office, but it might be the United Nations, it might be a private project, a charity or something, whatever the authorities send, there is still that disconnect, but you have to live with it.
And you often say, expect the unexpected.
Yes, yes, always
and
expect
that's absolutely true. Even when we go back now and everyone's got their mobile phones in a country we know, something comes along and we just collapse in a heap and laugh and say, it shouldn't happen this way.
You've got to have a sense of humour, but the stories you come home with are wonderful.
You have a second book?
Yes, I have a second book, yes. And that one, and you can see why that book meant a lot to me when I was young, and how it worked out in my life and in what we talked about today. The other book that means a lot to me is this little book called Animals and the Law. It's written by Thomas Field Fisher, who is a QC, an eminent lawyer, and he wrote the entire encyclopedia entry for animals, anything that is to do with animals and the law in the standard British Halsby's Laws, which is an encyclopedia of British law. But in my admiration was for him that he could condense this wealth of knowledge into this tiny little book to make it understandable to the lay person. And it came out just when I was emerging into animal law because of being nudged by my veterinary boyfriend. And that became a sort of benchmark for my writing, because it all tends to be in the veterinary or biological world. So it has to be explained. You can't go into too much detail and so on. So I suppose that the book I wrote, Adventure in Animal Law, was in that genre. But that is, that I would say those are two influential books on my life.
So Margaret chose two, and I've got two, but whether I'll do the second one, I don't know. I had a look at my shelves upstairs of books that mean a lot to me, you know, that if I was ill or something, I'd want to have reference to them. And it's coincidence in a way, but one that means so much to me has a link with South America. And it's called The Book of a Naturalist by W.H. Hudson. W.H. Hudson was born in Argentina, lived in Buenos Aires, had a tremendous feel for South America, for its people, which of course we applaud, and for its natural history. And he was the author, amongst other things, of The Naturalist in La Plata. And he then came to Britain, and he and his wife lived the sort of life perhaps we should be doing, slightly like gypsies, what are we supposed to say, gypsy Romanies, jolly interesting people, Romanies, etc., and had great naturalists. And he then wrote a whole series of books about natural history here. And I love this one, and I'll read the inscription because it says, and this was written long before I knew I'd produce it today, it says, I wrote this years ago, one of my favorite books, despite Hudson's rather ponderous style. I love, underlined the chapter, hints to adder seekers, adders, vipers. And I go on to say, it describes beautifully how I catch adders. And I still go out to heathland. I still love looking at snakes. I still love catching them. I take samples if there's a sample to take. Otherwise, I just rejoice in it and release it. Not everyone approves, but it changes my life. And W.H. Hudson did as well. Do you want another book, or are we running out of time?
We'll have one more book, please.
Now, this one goes back even further, and I think you're going to cut me out and say this man is too slushy and sentimental. I will stick to his wife. That's what most sensible filmmakers do. When I was at school, age 6, in 1950, I was at a primary school in Essex where we had a nature table. People don't have nature tables now, and it is a disgrace. We used to take things in, like my pine cones, feathers you found. Children who didn't have my interest in the natural world were introduced to it. Tadpoles came in, and then you released them a few days later. And my school teacher knew that I used to bring in things for that. And one day she asked me to clean out the cupboard of the books there because she was doing something. And at the end, she said to me, John, would you like to take one of those books as a thank you for doing the cupboard? And she gave me this one, which most people won't have heard of. It's called Smut the Hare. And it's written by a delightful man called Bramwell Evans, who called himself Romany, the word I couldn't find earlier on. This particular one is about the life of the hare and how he introduced a young boy called Tim to observing. Hear my voice drop, John, just as you do when you examine an animal, your voice drops, doesn't it? Because you've got to be gentle. How to spot these hares, how to know what their ears mean when they're up, when they're down, etc. And to this day, and that's decades, your viewers will think it was centuries ago, I still have this on the shelf. And when I see hares down the road here on our walks or cycle rides, I often think to myself, that book and the others in the series have influenced it. You offered us 5, but we thought 2 each. We're naturally modest, so we'll stick at that.
And we couldn't find one that had influenced us both together.
Or we didn't fall out over because it was some political tone. Yeah.
We could if we thought longer over it. Yes.
That was brilliant. I loved that. Next question. What is your most treasured possession in your laboratory?
Oh, I should explain to your viewers, this is my private laboratory here in Norfolk. I do work at Cambridge and Royal College of Surgeons and other places, but those are on. Oh, there are so many of them. But the one I've got is so appropriate today. And it is kept here, not in the lab, so that no one takes it when I'm not there. It looks to all intents and purposes like a little wooden box. It is a little wooden box, and it has a seal, an imprint on here. But this is a box with a difference. It is a box that contains invertebrates. These are triatom bugs. You will know what a triatom bug is. I'll close it for a minute. Triatom bugs, assassin bugs, the Americans call them, are the bugs, the Hemiptera, that in so much of South America transmit a trypanosome, that's related to the sleeping sickness organism called Trypanosoma cruzi, named after a famous Brazilian physician, and there's an institute named after him. But what makes these wonderful, not just that I've got them with the specimens and even now terribly dried their eggs, is it actually says inside that these were presented to this particular collection in Britain in 1932, by the famous Professor Carlos Chagas. I probably don't pronounce it correctly, Professor Chagas was a wonderful man, one of my heroes. I never met him. He was a hero for two reasons. One, he was a physician, a public health man. He was what we've needed in this COVID, a shoe leather public health man, going around communities, talking to people, following pathogens, etc. He was a wonderful man. And he discovered in 1909 this trypanosome, this blood parasite, this parasite, not necessarily in the blood, that causes a disease that to this day in South America affects directly or indirectly millions of people. And it's neglected because the West doesn't really think it's terribly important because we don't have it here. He's also a hero of mine. I know we're not meant to be political because he was nominated twice for the Nobel Prize and twice he was turned down. And the papers about it say it was politics largely. He was not a military man. And at that stage in Brazil, to get on, remember this was 100 plus years ago, being a military man, sometimes a woman I expect, was so important. He was not a military man, he was an independent thinker, and they didn't like the fact that he'd come up with this. So there was opposition to his nomination from within Brazil and nomination outside because people felt competition because he discovered this and they hadn't. So for those two reasons, one, because he was such a super bloke in his investigations, his interest in the natural world, as well as in the public health of Brazilians, but also because he suffered because of the hierarchy at the time who thought he shouldn't get the Nobel Prize. So that is my most valued possession there. And I'm going to hide it, John Beaumont, so you can't find it. Because our son, who's a medical doctor, has asked me to give it to him when I die, which won't be for several decades, but you might tell your viewers. Right.
For my part, I can't, John's laboratory to me is actually at least 50% museum. I can't say that I would fancy taking as a treasured possession anything off the shelves there. So I say I've opted to take John himself as my treasured possession.
Now that, ladies and gentlemen, is not bad after 52 years of marriage. Please don't cut that bit, even if you miss everything else out. I'd like it on tape or whatever you folks use nowadays when you make films.
It's a terrible concession.
Right. We're getting very slushy. Your viewers will have switched off by now, I should think.
Well, I thought that was brilliant. Next question. Do you have any advice, please, for people wanting to become veterinary surgeons or animal law specialists?
Yes, for my part, I say keep your background and your training as broad as you can, because that will provide you with the tools to do whatever you want to do if you have a passion or an interest in animal law.
And I would say, and I would like, if I may, to refer to the fact that not everyone may end up being a veterinary pathologist. They might be in some allied fields, because I'm aware your viewers are interested in animals. Whatever you do, do it with determination. I'm going to make this work. And remember that spirit of curiosity to which I alluded before. And also ask questions, just as John Beaumont is doing so well here. The most important question in the word in the English language is why. It should be used in everyday life. Why is this happening? Why is that bird singing like that? Why is something or another happening? Why isn't there frog spawn in the local pond this year? It's also important in society because why means that we are holding everyone to account, and that's part of democracy. That's it, I think, on that one.
It's the final question, unfortunately. Is there anything else you would like to add?
Well, we decided to call it take-home messages. We had visions of your viewers with their sandwiches and their Coca-Cola or something stronger saying, oh, thank heavens the Coopers have finished. Let's hope the last question is short. My take-home message is very short and it reflects how I feel. It's in 3 short phrases. Enjoy life, live it to the full, live adventurously.
And I say, by all means do that, but do try and keep your feet on the ground as well.
At which may we say thank you and also obrigado.
Obrigada.
Professor John E. Cooper, specialist in wildlife veterinary pathology, Mrs. Margaret E. Cooper, specialist in animal law. Thank you very much for being on the Practical Animal Channel.
It's a pleasure.
Thank you very much. And I think